Iran war began, and what was meant to be a 4-week war, in President Trump's own words, went on for over 3 months. And finally, there is now a memorandum of understanding between the United States and Iran. But in the last few days, both sides seem to have broken the ceasefire understanding. There have been intermittent exchanges of fire. Iran has been attacking commercial tankers. The United States, in turn, has been attacking locations inside Iran. Israel continues to occupy parts of southern Lebanon, and that, of course, is turning out to be a bit of a deal breaker. There are now open differences between Israel and the United States as to the further progress of this memorandum of understanding. The big question everyone is asking is, will this last? Will it continue for 60 days, or will the war restart? I want to go across to a very special guest, someone who's been inside the White House Situation Room in many, many meetings with President Trump and his military advisors. Lieutenant General retired Keith Kellogg is the former U.S. Special Envoy for Ukraine and Russia. Thank you very much, General Kellogg, for speaking with us here on Times Now. First of all, your thoughts, your impressions on this Iran Memorandum of Understanding, the 14-point agreement between Iran and America. Do you think this will last?
Yeah, Zakka, thanks for having me. It's good to be with you as well. This evening, your time, it's morning our time, and getting ready for the 4th of July here. I think when you look at the memorandum, that really reinforces that President Trump is trying to get to a diplomatic end to this conflict instead of a military end. Because militarily and economically, I think everybody kind of wants this thing to get over with, as well as in the rest of the world. And I think the memorandum, and Jared Kushner is there, and Steve Witkoff are right now in Oman to try to work that deal. We're having a little bit of a, I think an issue with the Iranians, and they've done a really distributed operation. Most of their leadership is gone. The supreme leader, the current one, is alive, but he's really not very visible out there to the rest of the world. And I think we're trying to get to a conclusion of the deal. I don't know if we're going to get there or not, primarily because they're being a little bit difficult in trying to establishing what the end state looks like. I think our end state is that there's freedom of navigation, there's freedom of the Strait of Hormuz. It should be wide open. It should not be regulated or taxed or tolled by the Iranians. That is a very controversial point for us, because most of the oil does not come to the United States. We're actually an exporter, not an importer. So it affects everybody else, and I think he's trying to get there with it. How it's going to go, that's a good question. I think we've got our negotiators on the ground. We've got a 60-day memorandum to go to a conclusion, and I think he wants to go diplomacy. And we'll see how it goes. If they keep attacking vessels, though, we'll keep responding and and I think because of that, because of the two sides trading weaponry kinetically, I think it's basically a 50-50 proposition. Will this memorandum mean anything to anybody?
So when the president launched this war, he had outlined 3 or 4 major objectives. One, of course, was regime change. You mentioned, right, there is now a younger leader. We don't know in what form or fashion he's ruling that country. So I want you to weigh in on that and whether that objective has been met, at least in partial measure. The most important was, of course, the nuclear question, and President Trump has been saying this repeatedly, that Iran will never possess a nuclear weapon. How closer to that reality are we now, or does Iran still have the ability to, crank up its uranium enrichment to the level required to produce a weapon? And the most important thing, which I think is the big difference, frankly, before the war and now, is that Iran, almost at will, is able to shut off the Strait of Hormuz. So on those 3 parameters, how do you see this war having achieved or not achieved its objectives?
Well, when it comes to regime change, he's talking about regime change as the leadership has changed out. When I talk regime change, there's a difference. We're talking about moving from a theocratic government that you see right now with the supreme leader to a more democratically aligned movement as well. So he hasn't talked about regime change as I talk about it. So I think people need to understand that. He's not advocating an overthrow of the government. He says that's up to the Iranian people. And 2 weeks ago, I was in Iran, the National Coalition for Iranian Resistance, and they said it's up to you. You need to make a decision on what you're going to do with the future of your government. On the second and and the nuclear capacity is, and this directly affects you because you are a nuclear power as well. You know, you treat a nuclear power significantly different when you discuss with them what's happening in the future. And our concern was that we didn't want to have a 10th nuclear power come into play, where we're fine with 9 right now. But we have experiences, for example, with Libya or North Korea as well. And getting rid of their enriched uranium and also their centrifuges is very important because they were close to what we called a breakout, meaning a breakout is they have the capacity to get a nuclear weapon in a shorter period of time because they have the enriched uranium to be able to do that. And we knew they were getting close to that when originally the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was calling for basically 3.67% enrichment. They were getting to 60 to 70%. Almost when you get to 80 and 90%, that's enough to make a nuclear weapon. And they had that as well. So our concern was, where are you going with this? Why do you have missiles that can reach all the way to France? Why are you enriching uranium to the levels you are? You ask yourself the same question. Are you going to a nuclear capacity, nuclear capability? And we don't want them to do that. Now, President Trump has taken great lengths to go in a diplomatic exchange, trying to get it that way, trying to get them to reduce that. But we haven't really had the ability to get on the ground with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Administration, to get people on the ground, look at their sites, inspect their sites with U.S. people, because we're not going to be taking the IAEA's word for it, because they've been stonewalled so many times, not only by them, but other nations like North Korea, that you trust, you've got to, we're going to verify with your own eyes that they've actually moved the enriched uranium or gotten the centrifuges down. So it's a very complicated issue. Bottom line is the president is taking a line that he does not want to have a 10th nuclear power. We see what happens when you get there with diplomacy. So that's the reason we're doing this. And I don't think you want a nuclear power in that region, in the Mideast region, because if the Iranians get a weapon like that, the Saudis will get one, the Qataris will get one, the Emiratis will get one. Now, the Israelis don't admit it, but we're pretty sure they're a nuclear power too. When I say a nuclear power, that means having nuclear weapons, not the amount necessarily as much, but the capacity to disrupt something with a nuclear weapon. And I think that for the good of the world, for the good of the region, you don't want them to have a nuclear weapon. And President Trump has made the decision we're not going to let them have one.
On the question of the Strait of Hormuz, you said a moment ago it should be free, it should be open, nobody should be charging for an international waterway. In whatever form or fashion it's going to get reopened fully, it's now becoming clear that there will be some kind of a transit fee or a toll or a service charge. You can call it whatever you want, but it'll be shared between Iran and Oman. How does that change the dynamic of the region?
Well, for example, you look at the Malacca Strait, okay, which a lot of the commerce goes through there to the South China Sea. They have I hate to use the term because it gets twisted, but for example, a toll or a fee to pay for their use in patrolling the strait. And I can see where that would happen, but I think you'd have to call it something than a toll or fee, because there's freedom of navigation. It's free to all nations. International law says that. But I understand the reason why, for example, places like when they have controls over the Straits of Malacca or something like that, you can go around that, but it just adds to transit time and the amount of money as well. So I think, I think that's part of the discussion. The Iranians are hard over about they're going to control it. Their foreign minister, Arachi, has said that they're going to control the Strait of Hormuz. No, they're not. It's international waterway, should freedom of navigation. It's a standard position by us and the rest of the Western nations that freedom of the seas is incredibly important, and we want to keep it that way. But so when you talk about toll, yeah, I can understand what you're talking about from my perspective, but from their perspective, it's different. Just charging a toll for ships to go through. Why are you charging that? What is it? Where does it go to? When you go between Oman and Iran, where is that money going to go? Is it going to go to a centralized banker? Is it going to go to a holding company? How are you going to do that as well? And I think those are discussions they have to have. The trouble is when you make comments like that, not use Zakka. I mean, when people make comments like that, they automatically heat up. and you try to lower that temperature and say, well, what do you mean? Exactly what are you talking about? And the precision of the discussions is going to be very important. That's the reason our negotiators are on the ground, and that's why we're trying to get to a diplomatic solution.
I just want to talk about, the domestic fallout of this war and whether that had any bearing in President Trump eventually agreeing to this peace understanding. Whether it was gas prices, I think in some places it had gone up to 4.50, in some places even closer to 5. He's, of course, concerned about that in an election year with midterms in 6 months' time. He's anyway very concerned about the fluctuation in oil prices. Very happy now in the last couple of weeks that oil's come back to about $70 a barrel, somewhere at the pre-war level. How much of that was driving this sort of bargain between Iran and the United States? And perhaps the Iranians also knew that there were domestic compulsions on President Trump.
Well, he said all along that it really doesn't affect what his thinking is, but I think you and I both know, Zakka, that when you get to close to the American midterm elections, that's going to have an impact. And you were very kind about how much gas costs. It's over $6 in California, so it's pretty high. So the prices have come down. I noticed that this morning they've come down as well. The price of oil, be it Brent crude or West Texas Intermediate, the price of the barrel of oil has come down, as it should. I think it's a little bit too much, still too high. We want to take some of the price off that. So that's going to lower the gas prices as well. But I think as a politician, all politicians, and I have not talked to them about this one, and I've not been in the West Wing discussions, but all politicians, I don't care what your stripe is, in America, if you're Republican or Democrat or independent, if you're a foreign leader as well, you understand politics, and it's got to affect your politics and what you think about it into the future. And he wants to bring those prices down, not necessarily for the election, but for the American people. That it's we don't want them to have another cost they don't need to have.
I want to talk a little bit about India and the U.S. and this bilateral relationship. There was a strategic partnership over the last 25 years. The last year has seen its fair share of troubles, whether it's on the trade front, the tariff front. India got sanctioned for importing Russian oil. And then, of course, in the last few months, there are concerns on the security front as well, that the Quad, for example, is not as much a priority to the Trump administration as previous administrations were. How would you speak to those concerns?
Well, I think the relationship with India and the United States is very good. And they've got a personal relationship with Modi and the president, which I think is important because he bases a lot of his governance on personal relationships. And I think what the United States is doing, it's basically prioritizing. It's not neglecting. And basically we said, okay, we need to prioritize one in our own hemisphere, Venezuela or Cuba, and making sure that's straight. And then we are now, into the Middle East, but also we're going to look at the Far East as well and what we have to do. And you with India will play a key part in that, with the United States as well, because they're dealing with China as well. And that's going to be primarily our big concern in the Pacific as well. But I think that the fact that, President Trump has a great relationship with you all, I think he wants to keep it that way. I think we do as well. You want to keep your friends closer, maybe your enemies even closer than that. And so I don't think as people should get excited about that, only because we've prioritized what our primary goal is for the American people. And again, we've moved our primacy primarily back to our regional hemisphere, and then looking sort of like, basically, when you look at the rest of the world, it's not that they're less important, but we only have so many resources we can apply, and we'll apply them to where we think it's most important.
Is there some kind of a new understanding between the United States and China? President Trump was in Beijing back in May, and the imageries and the pomp and show that we saw there, and there seems to be some kind of a calm in that relationship, and that, of course, is leading many here in India. The Japanese Prime Minister is starting her first visit to India today, even as we speak. What happens to countries like Japan or Malaysia or Australia, who are all concerned about, Chinese excesses, if you will, in this region?
Zakka, where we come from, and sort of like also with Europe as well, and we're saying it's your area, you take the primacy, but we will be there. When it came to places like Europe, what happened was they kind of said, well, let America take the lead and we'll just support. No, it's your region. You need to take the lead to do that. But we're not going to abandon anybody. We're not going to be an isolationist country. But we need to understand when you come to priorities, the priorities should be yours, and we'll be there with you as a partner and trying to get something done internationally. So I think it's a healthy relationship. It shows that we believe that countries like India they're equal in the diplomatic way, and I think we will support them as well. And I don't think there was any special deal cut with China. We recognize with China as a good emerging power. They're going to be an adversary for us. By the way, when you look at the word adversary, that doesn't necessarily mean enemy. It means that it's a competitor, and we understand the Chinese are going to be competitors, and we need to compete with them as well. But when any special deals cut, no. But we've told the Japanese, an example, this is kind of your area. With you work with the Philippines and Japan, India, in your part of the world, you're all kind of bracket that area as well, and we'll be there for you. But you need to take primacy for it.
Well, you were talking about adversaries and enemies, Russia and Ukraine, and that's a bit of your specialty. What is your assessment of where that war is right now? I mean, Russia can't seem to win outright. Ukraine will not lose. What's the status on the ground, and how do you see this playing itself out over the next, let's say, 6 months?
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting dynamic with Ukrainians. People thought that war was going to be over in 3 days. We're in our fifth year right now, and the Ukrainians have done very well. I think the problem is Putin. And what I mean by Putin is the fact that he is stubborn enough to realize he's going to keep fighting for something he's not going to get. His last try is to get the rest of Donetsk province, the oblast there, and the Ukrainians are not going to give that voluntarily. They're going to basically say to you, you have to fight for it if you want it. So I think where he's got himself in a position where when you look at things like losses, the losses he's sustained, both economic and professional, astounding. I'll give you an example. When he left Afghanistan, the Russian Soviet Union, they had lost 18,000 people. Okay, he's lost between 1.2 and 1.4 million people dead or wounded. That is an astronomical number. And now the Ukrainians are starting to hit deep, starting to affect his economy. The thing I'm hoping for is he finally says, I've had enough of this. We'll make the deal, basically call it where we're at as the status quo and go with it. It won't be de jure recognition. It'll be de facto, which means that you are physically on the ground, therefore you own the ground, and go for this for the long-term future on peace discussions. But we're not going to dictate to the Ukrainians what they can or can't do, not after 5 years of war. But I think that's what we're saying to the Europeans, you need to play a much stronger role. But the real obstacle to progress, I believe, is President Putin, because he's taking the losses he's taken. And sort of like I'd say to him, if I was there in the short soundbite, okay, go give it up and go home, and where you're at right now is the end of it. And let's see what if he does something.
All right. Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, thank you very much for joining us here on Times Now on this Global Exclusive. Thank you.
Zakka, thank you for having me.